Good day, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of Pathway to 17 Summit. My name is Tariro Nyimo, and I'm within the Inclusive Digital Finance stream. And we are in our session today with Hamilton from Strategic Impact Advisors. So if you were with us yesterday, we were talking about key design principles, and we delved into their research that they did with great impact for program officers for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This is sort of like a continuation of that story, but we're having a deep dive into the customer segmentation. So welcome once again to Hamilton, who will be teaching us more about the research that they did. Just to say hello, Hamilton.
Thanks, Tariro. So let me share my screen real quick. Hi, everybody. It's good to be back. So as Tariro mentioned yesterday, if you were with us, some of this might be a little repetitive at the beginning just to set it up, but I wanted to make sure that everyone here has some background on the work that we did with Great Impact and the Gates Foundation, specifically the Financial Services for the Poor team at the Gates Foundation. My colleague Alex Fiorello at Great Impact isn't able to join us today, so she sends her apologies. She's a new mother, so she's caring for her new baby girl. I wanted to talk a little bit today with you all about the work we did in complementary with Mathematica, who is also working with the Gates Foundation on using Findex data to create sort of a segmentation model that could be applicable in all the markets that Findex covers. So for this particular work, we just focused on the Financial Services for the Poor team's 9 focus countries. That's available. Those resources are all available. We'll put up a link for you all to access all of these resources if you want to dive in a little bit deeper. So just to kind of start things off, again, sort of to highlight some objectives of this work. Essentially what we really wanted to do for this work is to examine a set of barriers inhibiting women's access and usage of financial services, determine which barriers are most resonant to different segments of women in different markets, and make recommendations about the kinds of interventions and programs that might help remove or mitigate or address these barriers so women can have access to and use a range of financial services that will fit their needs. Ultimately, our goal is to remove barriers to women's economic empowerment in the financial inclusion space and arena. A part of our work really has been to help ensure that the Financial Services for the Poor team at Gates Foundation is focusing on and addressing the right barriers in their particular context that they're working in to achieve the team's We5 2030 vision statement and strategic goals, which the vision statement is on the right. So by 2030, women have near ubiquitous and equal access to DFS and can easily, safely, and confidently use them to manage their complex daily lives and aid in their aspirations over which they have agency and control. So these are sort of the primary objectives of our work with the Gates Foundation. Just moving on, basically what we've done and the resources that you'll find on that microsite, that link that we've put up, is there's a really sort of big resource deck that has a bunch of analysis on the barriers and also on sort of opportunities and exemplars that we found and that we looked at to identify ways that people have tried, different interventions that people have tried to overcome the barriers, as well as different types of tools like a diagnostic tool that helps sort of you do a quick assessment of where your particular population that you're working with is on sort of a customer journey and where barriers might be related to that customer journey. And basically helping, all of these are tools that help you both identify kind of the key barriers that might be more relevant and more impactful in the context that you're working. And then linking those specific barriers to ideas on how to overcome them through these exemplars, and sort of this reference guide of how people have tried it in the past. What are the design elements around those interventions, and what were sort of the enabling environments around those interventions, to help you all think about how to design and develop interventions moving forward. Great. So I just wanted to run through the barriers real quickly. Obviously, this is sort of a list of barriers that were created by the FSP team. These are barriers that oftentimes are barriers for both men and women, but a lot of times women face these barriers sort of at a greater degree of intensity. So we have 8 categories of barriers. Accessibility, which is thinking about sort of access to agents, access to physical points of access, and then also thinking about mobility constraints that women face within sort of their particular context and lives. Consumer protection, so looking at things like fraud, social media harassment, difficulty resolving complaints, things of that nature. Cost is obviously a huge barrier for everyone, but it's in particular a larger barrier for women. So cost of using the digital financial service tools, cost of internet, right? The fact that some fees are not very transparent, etc. Human resources. So there's 2 main ones there: lack of female agents, which is something I think a lot of people are looking at these days. And Soheli yesterday from the Central Bank of Bangladesh was mentioning that female agents, and the lack of female agents made it difficult for women to feel more comfortable interacting with a financial services product. So thinking about that, and then also lack of women in leadership in these companies that are rolling out DFS products, and also in the policymaking and government parts of the market system for digital finance. Information and capability. So looking at sort of this really is where like literacy comes in, as well as information about products and services. So we're looking at digital literacy, financial literacy, basic literacy, and numeracy, in addition to sort of information about how the product works and how to open accounts and things of that nature. Prerequisites, which is a big one. So thinking about things like ID, phone ownership, network connectivity, requirements around accessing an account and opening an account, so your customer requirements, things of that nature. So looking at sort of the basic sort of building blocks that and enablers for access to financial services. Product and service quality, so looking at product design, sort of the lack of products that meet women's needs, the difficulty in navigating an interface of a digital product, things of that nature. And then finally, social norms, which is one, that these are barriers, but they're also, I think, just cross-cutting and omnipresent when it comes to access to financial services and women's economic empowerment. They, are there for all women in all segments in all markets. There are social norms that are sort of working against them. So just keeping them in mind, as well as we're moving through these ideas on barriers to address and things of that nature. Social norms are always going to be there. Great. So now we're diving into what the sort of topic that we want to focus on. So we did some work, as I mentioned, with Mathematica and the Gates team on segmentation. So Mathematica took 2017 Findex data. The 2021 Findex data we're still working on that. With Mathematica, we'll do sort of a comparison between 2017 and 2021. But right now, the data that we're going to show you today and all the graphs is based on 2017 data. So there's going to hopefully be a shift in some of these segments and the percentage of populations that markets have in each segment. But just to kind of go over what the segmentation model looked like, we have 4 segments. Segment 1 is what we call the excluded and marginalized segment. So these are customers or people that don't have an account at all. They don't use any sort of basic transaction. They haven't done an over-the-counter transaction or any other transaction with a formal financial service in the past 12 months. They don't have an income stream that they mentioned in the Findex questionnaire. So that could be from employment, that could be from agriculture, that could be from having your own business, or it could be a G2P payment, but they don't have any of that. So there's no social protection that their programs that they're participating in. And then also they don't have access to services. So when we say access to services, we mean they don't have a phone, and these sort of physical points of service are very far away. So segment 2 is excluded high potential. So these are people that also do not own phones. Sorry, they do not own an account, but they have conducted a basic transaction. They have used a formal financial service in the past. And they do have an income stream, whether it's from employment or from sort of a agriculture sector, or having their own business, or they're participating in a social protection scheme and receiving a cash transfer. And they also have phones, and they're closer to institutions, financial institutions and points of service. So segment 3 really is what we call included underserved. These are women who have accounts, but are using them, either not at all or at a very basic level. And segment 4, we're calling included not underserved. So these are women in a market that have accounts and are using more advanced transactions and are using them on a more regular basis. Great. So, while observing evidence behind each barrier, we were also tagging which pieces of sort of evidence and which barriers are more relevant to the profile of women in each segment, right? So we were thinking about, okay, when we were reading through evidence on, phone and SIM ownership, we were thinking, okay, which segments in context was this research focusing on? Were these women with accounts? Were they women without accounts? Were they in very rural areas with very low access? So through that process, we started doing some tagging, and from that, we've sort of found sort of which barriers are more relevant to specific segments, right? Now, it's not saying that any of the other barriers aren't relevant, but these were the ones that we really felt kind of bubbled up to the top. And what you're seeing right now are the barriers that are very similar across segments 1 and 2. So as you can see, barriers that women in segments 1 or 2 are facing are more related to categories like the prerequisites, so like a phone and ID access, costs of using the digital financial services, access again to points of service, and information as well. So literacy, digital literacy, lack of peers and family network using DFS. So those are sort of the barriers that kind of really bubbled up to the top for these particular segments. And then when you move to segment 3, many of the barriers are similar. So any barrier that's not highlighted in purple carries over from this slide to the next slide. So again, women in segment 3 are facing a lot of the same barriers as women in segment 1 and 2. But there are additional barriers that are more relevant for women in segment 3, which include barriers related to consumer protection and products and service quality, right? As they start using the products more and more, there's a point where the products work for them and they use them more, or they just don't work very well and they drop off and aren't using them too much. So there's sort of a fork in the road there in segment 3 in their customer journey. Great. So we wanted to look at what the breakdown was across all markets. So Mathematica did all this analysis based on the Gates focus countries. So you see the color coordination there. This is a global look at each country's breakdown by segment. So you can see that India's population makes up a significant portion of the total population of the FSP focused markets. You can see that segment 3 in India is massive. This is due to the success of Aadhaar accounts in terms of just having access to Aadhaar accounts. But again, segment 3 are women that have accounts but aren't necessarily using them. So that fits the bill of what we've heard coming out of India in terms of these Aadhaar accounts being sort of idle and used. and not used for a lot of transactions. We wanted to look at the breakdown. So globally, you see segment 3 with India's influence is the largest globally with 53%, and segment 1 is the second largest. But we wanted to take India out of the situation, and when you do, there's a significant shift to the left, right? So segment 1, as you can see, the distribution has shifted to segment 1, having the most women across the world sort of in segment 1, with segments 2 and 3 being fairly equal. But again, sort of India's influence globally within this context, when taken out, we look and see that segment 1 is the most prevalent in terms of population of women globally within these 8 markets minus India. So with the gender gap, we also wanted to look at the gender gap between segments, right? So this is, again, with India, all markets combined, you can see that segments 3 and 4 are relatively equal, even with women, there are more women having a greater percentage in segment 3. So the real battleground for equity comes in segments 1 and 2, where you have more women in segment 1 than men, and many more men than women in segment 2. So again, the women that are in the lowest segment, there's more women, and sort of this segment where there's high potential, there's more men. So I wanted to this is with India. So you can see obviously segment 3 is sort of the greatest, but then moving to without India, you can see the gap sort of even widen more greatly in segments 1 and 2. This is really just a reflection of the narratives that we hear all the time around the digital gender gap and the financial services gender gap. And also the inequities women face when it comes to unpaid work that is done in the household. So more men have access to income generating activities, more men have phones. So it makes sense that there would be more men than women in segment 2, which is sort of some of the criteria that we used to differentiate between segments 1 and 2. But it's pretty stark when you look at it. I mean, double the number of men in segment 2 than women, and more than double the amount of women than men in segment 1. So lots of work to do specifically around segments 1 and 2 when it comes to the gender gap there. Great. So if you were in our session yesterday, you've already seen an example of the specific market analysis, but I wanted to take everyone through a couple country slides. So we're going to look at Bangladesh really quickly for segment 1, and we're going to look at Ethiopia and then Uganda. So as you can see, Bangladesh segment 1 is the largest segment with 42% of women in segment 1, and segment 3 is the second largest. This slide looks at sort of the different segments and where they are from an employment perspective, from an education level perspective, and from an age perspective. So you can see that segment 1, as you can see, there's no work income, which is fairly high. In this, and that secondary education is actually they're actually pretty high in terms of education, higher than segment 2, which is interesting. But they're also extremely young in segment 1. These are again the barriers that are most relevant for, or we found to be most relevant for segment 1. But we did a little bit more research into the question, why don't you own an account, which is part of the Findex. So that helped us sort of identify specific barriers that might be a little bit more important in Bangladesh versus and barriers that might be less important. So for example, 55% of women in segment 1 cited not having enough money as a primary barrier for a lack of access to an account. So this barrier of perceived and lack of money is prevalent everywhere throughout the Findex. It's a major barrier that people cite as a primary reason they don't have an account. In terms of barriers that might be less important, and this is sort of contradictory, but again, remember this is to what we've heard from Shoheli yesterday, but this is a high level data, right? So it's not looking at specifically rural areas, but only 15% of women in segment 1 cited distance as a barrier. And then also only sort of 19% of women in segment 1 cited the lack of documentation as a barrier to accessing an account. So some of these things might be a little bit more relevant, some of them might be a little bit less relevant, but they're all relevant, right? This is not trying to take away from the importance of these barriers. I'll quickly move through this to Ethiopia, which segment 2. So looking at segment 2, agriculture is the biggest employment sector. They are fairly uneducated in terms of their education levels, and also very young. Again, same exercise. Why don't you have an account? Again, you can see perceived lack of money is right there. 86% of women cited that. Also, basic literacy and numeracy is still a big problem in Ethiopia. 94% of women in segment 2 have primary levels of education or less. So basic literacy and numeracy is a relevant barrier. Some things that might be less relevant, just based on the data, 7.3% of women in segment 2 cited a lack of documentation as a barrier. Also, the World Bank estimates that 80 to 95% of Ethiopian adults have IDs, so that might be a little bit less of a barrier in this context. And then finally, for Uganda, segment 3 is the largest, segment 1 being the second. And for segment 3, agriculture is the biggest employment sector. Again, they're 57% have primary or less, so they're a bit more educated. And then they're all fairly young. And then things that were more and less important in Uganda, cost of DFS. People have issues with sort of the taxation there, but basic numeracy and literacy may be a little less important. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand it over to Tariro to have some Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Hamilton, for that teaching. I think it's very interesting going through all the different barriers, and trying to analyze each barrier and what to prioritize, which barriers to prioritize, and which ones are less of an issue, or even which interventions are really relevant for that context. So I'm going to go back to segment 1, which is your excluded and underserved. And we're saying that this woman who falls in this category, especially for the examples that you gave for Bangladesh and maybe Pakistan, which had a greater proportion, we exclude India, of them in segment 1. What can we do to this group to really get them to move from this segment where they're possibly facing a lot of supply issues, supply barriers, and demand barriers, a combination of both, and move them into a place where they have high potential in segment 2? What can we do?
Yeah, so segment 1 is a tricky one, right? Because it's not necessarily a segment that financial services can potentially do everything for, right? They need really a blended approach. So what we found in terms of sort of how to move them up the chain to segment 2 and segment 3, hopefully segment 4 eventually, is a blended approach of livelihoods programs, things like graduation programs, and then also social protection is a huge element of their support. So ensuring that women in that segment, we're not just throwing financial service products at them, right? That's not going to get it done, right? These are populations that are very poor, that like the lack of money is not perceived, that there is a lack of money for them to utilize financial service products. So it's got to be like working with that segment. There has to be sort of a blended approach, and financial services need to be a support mechanism versus sort of a lead intervention or design element of any type of intervention that you're going to tackle barriers in those contexts. So creating and trying to generate livelihoods and income is sort of a priority for those segments, and then supplementing that with financial service products is helpful.
Mm-hmm. And I also found that segment 2 is quite interesting, the one that has a high potential. And when you looked at the gender gaps and when you were going through the graphs, both with the India data and without the India data, that segment, the male side of it, is much wider. So we are viewing men to have more potential, and you kind of gave some of the reasons there. And Ethiopia is the one that represents this segment even more. Can you try and give us more information? What does this reiterate about what we're saying about women and what causes this persistent gender gap?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mentioned just generally the way that the criteria for the segmentation is set when it looks at things like income, right? So do you have a source of income? Do you have access to a phone? Those are things that we know there's gender gaps that exist, right, in the world already. The fact that, less women are likely to own a phone. Women are more likely to have a larger percentage of unpaid care and work that gives them sort of it's stress on their time. They don't have time to do income generating activities. That is reflected in that segment 2 gap, right? Within that. So I think focusing in on those elements, those gaps, the barriers that lead to those gaps. So, again, I mentioned social norms, like that is a big one, right, around unpaid care and work. And then also things around phone ownership, cost of mobile internet, things of that nature. Those are kind of big prerequisite barriers that need to be overcome and addressed to help so that movement from segment 1 to 2, particularly with women. So I think it's, with Ethiopia having a large segment 2 population, we didn't do a bunch more sort of digging into why. That was actually the only market that had a majority segment 2 population. I think we can assume that there's a couple reasons. One could be that there's a strong access to social protection programs, or there's just more participation in income generating activities on the side of women. The other is we know that mobile phone access isn't great in Ethiopia still. Safaricom's just about to launch M-Pesa, and that market is now coming along. Has come along more slowly, but now that things are a bit more democratized, that hopefully that will pick up. But our only sort of guess is that it's really the women in Ethiopia at this point, based on Findex data, had more income generating activities going on, and also were closer to points of access and points of service. That's what the data would suggest for Ethiopia.
Hmm. And I see this tool or this research, someone, maybe a digital finance provider, using it to really map out their strategy for different products, right? Focusing on women. And when you get to a stage where you're looking at a woman who's included but underserved, and you cited the example of India, where because of Aadhaar, people have accounts, but they're still underserved. So what sort of advice would you give, because you've launched something, you've launched an intervention, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you still, when you do your data, when you look at it, you still see that it's not working. Women are not participating as much. Some of the women are still falling into this, even if they opened up that mobile account or they opened it up, the once-off thing, they're really not using it. What sort of advice would you give to DFS providers still on how to make sure that these women move to be served instead of underserved?
Yeah, so for segment 3, I think, that one slide that sort of pointed out the differences and the barriers that kind of popped up for segments 1 and 2 and 3. Obviously having a greater focus on developing and designing products for women, keeping them as a sort of a center customer and idea when you're building out products is important. So all of the issues and barriers that popped up around product and product design and quality are pretty relevant for segment 3. So taking that into account, getting to know the customer's needs a bit more is really important. And then, of course, consumer protection. Even though someone might not experience fraud or be a victim of fraud, they hear about it, right? It's a word of mouth thing that does make people worried and scared to try a new product and service. So paying attention to that, messaging and actual protection around those types of issues can help gain trust and confidence in products and hopefully build up and increase usage, moving them from segment 3 to segment 4.
Thank you so much, Hamilton. I, for one, am very excited about this research and what it can do and how we can even embed it into some of our courses, practice using it, segment, and see what we can have for different countries. And there might be other countries that might not have as much data, or even launch some data projects to get to this kind of segmentation for countries all around the world, or even countries within our alumni. So I want to thank you for the 2 sessions that you gave us to kind of take us through the research. And to the audience, thank you so much for being part of Pathway to 17 Summit. We had a short session today, and we got some teaching and some a few discussion, and wishing you the happy end of Pathway to 17 Summit, and see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rio. If anyone has any questions, just reach out to me. No problems on the platform. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rio. Take care.